together to repair the deep harms of ongoing colonialism and implement the Auditor General's recommendations. I'd like to make that point very clear, that the issues pointed out in the report can only be resolved through the work of true partnership with Indigenous peoples and full self-determination of First Nations, which are things that the federal government for a very long time have worked to actually undermine. And that's why this government has been working hand in hand with First Nations to close the housing gap referenced in the Auditor General's report, which the Assembly of First Nations estimated at $44 billion in 2021. I thank the AFN for their important work in quantifying the gap and providing us a starting point. We've used this gap analysis to inform our path forward, and together with the AFN, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and First Nations across Canada, we've co-developed the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy, which provides us with a path forward to transfer control and management of housing to First Nations. I see the job of the Indigenous Services Minister and the Government of Canada as one to make sure that communities have the support they need to do the work outlined in this strategy. And I can say that last year, Indigenous Services Canada spent a historic amount on infrastructure. In fact, the most the department has ever spent, and we're on track to spend even more. Budget 2024 recently proposed $426 million over 5 years for First Nations housing and related infrastructure on reserve starting this year, on top of the amounts that are already allocated. But the work that we're undertaking is not just about numbers and increased investments. It's about the capacity building to support self-determination and continued work to transfer the care and control of housing to First Nations, because as I've said, they know best how to meet their housing needs. For example, since 2020, Indigenous Services Canada has provided over $3 million to the First Nations Housing Professionals Association. This money is training community members on project management, construction planning, tenant relations, renovation, and repair coordination. And they've certified 48 housing professionals. There are additional 151 people in training, and this will build housing capacity in First Nations communities across the country. Another example, in my own hometown of Thunder Bay, Indigenous Services Canada supports the Indigenous Skilled Trades Training Program in its partnership with Hammersholt High School, where students learn construction skills and build tiny homes, which then get donated to Matawa First Nations. I had an opportunity to visit Hammersholt and meet with some of the students involved in that project. And in fact, one of those students is now on my youth council. It's truly an inspirational project. And this program not only helps students build new skills, but it also connects them to a career in the skilled trades, something that, as many of us know from other committees and work, we desperately need. We're also supporting the transfer of housing and infrastructure services at a pace that is set by First Nations-led organizations. For example, the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq signed a framework agreement with Indigenous Services Canada in October of 2023 to assume control of design, management, provision, and delivery of their housing and infrastructure programs. So I believe, Mr. Chair, this is the path that we need to maintain, that in the spirit of reconciliation, the time has passed where the Government of Canada tells First Nations what to do, but rather works with First Nations communities to not only build homes, but build that capacity and transfer services so that it helps communities move on to other economic development opportunities that can meet the needs of their growing populations. So thank you for having me today, Mr. Chair, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister. Begin our first round. The first 4 members will have 6 minutes each. Mr. Malillo, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do want to thank the Minister for being here. I know that, Minister, you've made yourself available for a number of committee discussions in recent weeks at various committees, and I do sincerely appreciate you making that time. I had the opportunity to question you about this report earlier this year. I asked, Minister, if you accepted the report. And your response was that you accept all recommendations, which I do think is a good thing. However, there is a difference between accepting the recommendations and accepting the report in its entirety. Of course, the report highlights that your government has no plan to reach its housing goals, and that the state of housing on First Nations has not improved since 2015. So I'd like to offer you the opportunity to answer again and confirm whether or not you do accept the entirety of this report as an accurate representation of the state of First Nation housing?
We do accept the report, and in fact, although we continue to speak with the Auditor General about, for example, our current allocation methodologies and in exploring changes with communities, we agree that the situation for First Nations in regards to housing needs to change, and so we think that the Auditor General has given us valuable advice, and certainly I'm happy to turn to Mr. Barbosa if you want to add anything about your conversations with the auditor.
Apologies, Mr. Barbosa. I just have limited time. I just want to ask another question because you did answer my question adequately, Minister. You said you agreed or you accepted the recommendations. You agree that things need to change, and unfortunately, it's been your government that has had the power to make that change for the last 9 years. And of course, as the Minister of Indigenous Services, the buck stops with you presently. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to ask Chief Lance Heyman about what this report means in reality for First Nations that he works with. And he noted that CMHC is going to build 30 units for 43 communities in Quebec this fiscal year. I believe that's less than 3/4 of a unit per community. Would you agree, Minister, that is unacceptable?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Chief Heyman. It was great to have him at our economic roundtable just the other day, the one that was hosted by the Bank of Canada. In fact, as you know, he is also working with an organization called Yanachia, and our department is working closely with Chief Heyman on how to accelerate that work around home ownership. I will say that I think the context of Mr. Heyman's... I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
I just want to clarify.
Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
Well, Minister, just to hold, I've stopped the clock. Minister, there is some give and take here on the floor. This is not like question period where you're assigned the slot. The time belongs to the members. Previously, you heard Mr. Malillo, after you answered the question, want to move on. He did that. He is entitled to interrupt if he does so politely, and I would ask that you respect that. The time is the members, not the witnesses. Mr. Malillo, you have the floor.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. And with respect to the Minister, I believe I asked a pretty straightforward question about whether or not she believes that 30 units for 43 communities is acceptable or not. And I'd like to give her the opportunity to respond.
I would say CMHC is not the only partner in supporting First Nations housing.
But again, a direct question, do you believe that that is an acceptable level of housing?
I can't speak to the CMHC manner of apportioning support and funding. That is not the portfolio I hold. But what I can say is that every department that has a responsibility for housing is part of the solution to closing the gap.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I'll move on. The Auditor General also finds in the report that there were not adequate assurances that homes built on First Nation were meeting applicable building code standards in the jurisdiction that First Nation is in. And I think that's a very important aspect of this, because it's one thing to have houses, but they have to be adequate, they have to be safe, and having not a failure to comply with building codes puts First Nation lives at risk. So, Minister, again, do you believe this is acceptable, and why have you allowed this to happen under your watch?
I will say that all federally funded housing on reserve must meet or beat the National Building Code and must demonstrate compliance as a condition for that funding. But I will also say that I am encouraged by your line of questioning that you will support any additional investments and not vote against them again.
And I just want to clarify on that, because, Minister, you just said that all federal funding for housing, it must meet the applicable building codes, but the Auditor General has found that that's not the case. So why isn't that happening?
I will say that, again, federally funded housing must meet or beat the National Building Code. And I would hope that you understand that in order to meet National Building Codes, that quality materials must be used, that First Nations must have the supports they need to maintain those buildings, to keep them up to code. And so I would look forward to your vote in favor of any additional spending in First Nations housing.
I understand all of that, but again, Minister, it's not happening. Why?
I will say again, that funding that is dedicated to First Nations housing on First Nations must meet or beat. Obviously, as I mentioned, we are working to support First Nations to ensure that housing complies with the code, and I look forward to your support in additional investments that make that possible. Okay,
thank you, Minister. I'd like to ask, obviously we have this report before us on housing, highlighting that no progress has been made, that there's no plan to address those housing gaps on First Nation. We know that Your government has dragged its feet to address First Nation policing, another very important issue, and the list goes on and on and on. We've seen PBO reports showing that there's been more spending, but not an equal level of ISC's ability to achieve its targets from that spending. Yet with all of this failure, frankly, your department has handed out $3.6 million in bonuses to 94% of ISC's executive staff in the 22-23 fiscal year, and over $4 million to 98% of staff in the following fiscal year. Why are you rewarding staff for this failure?
Well, let me also remind you what the Auditor General noted, that the ongoing and historic lack of investment, in particular the decade before 2015, meant that not only were we not staunching the decline in housing on First Nations, but in fact the gap was growing. And when we were elected, we increased funding by 185% for First Nations housing, 1,100% overall for infrastructure. And that speaks to the lack of attention that the previous Conservative government had for First Nations people. In fact, I encourage you,
You've had 9 years,
Mr. Milillo.
And that, lady, that is the time. I'm going to turn now to Ms. Shanahan. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and I thank the Minister for being here with us on this very important topic, because indeed it has been a longstanding problem. We heard testimony the other day going back to the early 2000s about the structural problems in addressing housing needs on First Nation reserves and on and off reserves, I would say, and also the chronic lack of funding, which I know that our government has tried to address. It's certainly been, it's not just one size fits all, I would, from what I'm gathering from the testimony that we're hearing. So this is the fourth OAG report on First Nations housing, calling for serious systemic changes to the Government of Canada supports and programs. And it's clear that our existing systems have led us to this unacceptable housing gap. But we've heard a lot of allegations thrown around in this committee about who's to blame for allowing this to happen. And I'd like to hear your perspective on how we reached this point.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Shanahan, and thank you for your advocacy. I will say this, the lack of infrastructure in First Nations is a result of a colonial country that has failed to live up to its obligations, treaty and otherwise, to First Nations people in this country. There is a willfulness to doing that, and our government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, decided that we would tackle reconciliation in a real and sincere way. In fact, compare that to the previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who said that an inquiry, for example, into missing and murdered Indigenous women was not on his radar. Or to MP Waugh, when I introduced the water legislation in this House just a couple months ago, who said that First Nations people just burn down their water treatment plants anyway, so they themselves are to blame. These are the kinds of comments that indicate that colonial attitude, that the Government of Canada, that it's wasted money, quite frankly, in First Nations, that they don't deserve it. You'll note that the Conservatives never ask a question in the House of Commons about Indigenous priorities. When was the last time we heard a Conservative get up and ask about why there isn't more housing in First Nations, or how come a particular boil water advisory hasn't been lifted, or why there isn't better supports for First Nations education, which are all reasonable questions. And I want to thank the NDP and the Bloc for asking questions about Indigenous peoples. This is important. It's important because it keeps it on the radar of Canadians. Canadians ultimately elect us. They elect us. And if they don't know what the problem is, because their members of parliament are not visiting communities that are within their own ridings, have never met those communities, don't know those people, then it's very hard for them to do their job. But when a prime minister says reconciliation will be at the core of what we do, then the hard work begins. And that's exactly what's happened in this file. You know, since 2016, we've invested over $10 billion to support Indigenous housing projects. Budget 2024, 25% of the new spend is on Indigenous priorities. That's continued progress. And can we fix a system of colonialism in 9 years? I don't believe we can. But if you speak to many First Nations people, they will say things are better than they were. and we have a long way to go. And I would agree with that.
For that, because I would say, even in my own riding, we border Ganawage, and what was unthinkable, I would say, 10, 20, 30 years ago is happening now, where we have joint partnerships between community organizations in Chateauguay with community organizations in Ganawage for supportive housing, for example, for youth in transition. And this has been a game changer in our relationship. And so I really do believe that we need to start today. Today is the first day of making change. And we did hear some very interesting testimony from Regional Chief Brendan Mitchell, who spoke about the collaboration between the AFN and Indigenous Services Canada in quantifying the housing and infrastructure gap. And I put the emphasis on infrastructure because I think that's where things need to start. But why was it important for the Government of Canada to be part of this report?
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's important because oftentimes First Nations organizations like the AFN may not have the fiscal resources or the technical resources to be able to quantify a gap like that. But in fact, the Government of Canada, despite how difficult it is to hear this for many Canadians, and indeed for governments and for members of Parliament, believes that we can't actually close a gap if we don't know the size of it. And so it is a commitment to First Nations, quite frankly, to support that research, to be able to work with partners, to provide funding to partners, to do Indigenous-led research on, in this case, what the size of the infrastructure gap is, so that not more communities like Chateauguay and Kanawake can say, this is all of our problem. I'm so glad you brought up your community and the work of reconciliation that happens at the municipal level. I have a similar story with Marathon and Beatagong in Thunder Bay Superior North, two northern communities that have worked together to develop relationship. Friendships have become regular and routine. I go to wing night at the Legion, and there are many members of Beatagong enjoying wings and beer with other members of Marathon, and they have joined economic activities, and they built a supportive living center together, and they are working together on many exciting endeavors together, but that happens through relationship. And Beatagong and Marathon, I suspect Chateauguay and Kanawake, are realizing that there's an economic advantage to reconciliation. Listen, it is extremely expensive to keep people in poverty. But when we start to realize that we're each other's people and we come together in ways that at all levels of government, like you've just pointed out, there is such an opportunity, not just in terms of better relationships and better outcomes for Indigenous people and but for the economy of Canada to do better.
Thank you, Minister. That is the time. Suivant, c'est Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Hello, Madam Minister. Thank you for appearing before the committee once again. So we know that, and we're not going to go into the detail, we've already heard the figures before the committee, but the report of the Auditor General is quite alarming on the state of construction for new housing. We agree because you've accepted the report and the recommendations. When we think that in terms of proportion, that very few increases of new housing starts with regards to what's necessary, and very few housing units were repaired, is quite alarming. So I would like to congratulate you that in your introductory speech you did mention that finally, after 150 years or more of Confederation, to reach the conclusion that the federal government should withdraw from Indigenous issues. And I think that's actually a good thing. But one of the major challenges to overcome, and when we speak of Indigenous housing development and the development of First Nations, is found in the certain elements of the Indian Act. So it's not just you, but you and also Northern Affairs, but yourself as a minister. What are you doing if you understand that you do need to withdraw from assistance and allow Indigenous peoples to manage themselves? What are you doing to at least reduce the amount of obstacles in their way?
La question.
Thank you for the question.
let's be clear, I think there is always going to be a role for the federal government to honor the treaties, and I'm not sure if it's the translation, but withdraw may not be the exact translation that you mean.
On va pas commencer à critiquer le travail des interprètes.
So we're not going to start criticizing the interpreters, but...
Criticizing the interpreter. I'm just saying the word withdraw, I assume that's what you mean. And what I would say is that there isn't a withdrawal from treaty. Treaties are actually agreements that are signed till the sun shines and forever.
Excusez-moi, Madame la Ministre, j'ai posé une...
Sorry, I asked a very specific question on elements that are roadblocks.
La loi sur les Indiens.
And I'm telling you that there isn't a concept
Point of order,
that
Chair.
could withdraw from treaty.
Point of order.
Just one, yes, Mr.
The minister knows full well.
Okay, Mr. Brock.
No, I'm talking about over each other.
Mr. Brock, this is not your time. Madame Séclair is able to defend her round. You will have an opportunity to ask questions of the minister, but it is not now. Madame Séclair, vous avez 3 minutes.
You have 3 minutes and 30. You have 3 minutes and 30 seconds left. Yes, I'd like to remind you that we're not here to criticize the interpreters, but to answer questions. Please. So, Madam Minister, here's a second, for a second and a third time, the Indian Act, some elements, I hate the name, but some elements in this act are hindering economic development, construction of new housing, trying to obtain funds from a bank. And so there are roadblocks in the way. What is your government doing, at least to stop hindering?
So that's a very... That is exactly the approach that our government has taken. In fact, the Indian Act, although it is hated by many, many First Nations people, and of course many people would like to see the elimination of the Indian Act, there are other First Nations people who feel that until those protections, and there are some within the Indian Act, are established in other pieces of law, that act needs to remain and be dismantled piece by piece. And so depending on who you speak to, you will hear different perspectives. That is why we've approached inherent rights through other legislation, like the child welfare legislation, that I will point out the government of Quebec fought at the Supreme Court and in fact lost. The federal government supported that legislation all the way through that Supreme Court process, which established an inherent right. Well, I shouldn't say it established. It restored the inherent right, actually, of First Nations people to raise their children and families. So that is how we are approaching eliminating the Indian Act.
J'ai précisé un élément important qui est, par exemple...
I spoke to an important element, that a bank can seize a property. So this is a roadblock. It's an issue now with commercial banks. We know it. It's an issue. It's a problem. If someone from a reserve is trying to get a loan, there are programs. You did speak to the programs, and I'm pleased at the Bloc Québécois we're pushing for these types of programs. So I'm very happy. But are you going to follow the example of Yanashia and reduce obstacles in the way that are created by the federal government for these First Nations?
Answer is yes, and that's the point behind things like the Economic Roundtable that we had just a week ago or two, hosted by the Bank of Canada with attendance by all of the major banks, the First Nations Bank of Canada, the Infrastructure Bank, to talk about the barriers to accessing capital, including for housing, posed by various pieces of legislation, but also by internal bank processes themselves. And the enthusiasm in that meeting was, if I could have tapped that enthusiasm, I would have brought it with me everywhere.
That's great. Thank you, Madam Minister. This week, we saw the former clerk of the Privy Council and former Deputy Minister of Indigenous Affairs to say that he didn't really believe that we needed to take away the responsibility to fund or to build, and that this should be given to a whole new Crown Corp. What do you think about that?
Yeah, having not heard his comments, I don't want to speak directly to his comments. I'll answer what I think you're saying. But I would say that the work that we're doing right now on infrastructure reform is the appropriate way. That what the government should be doing is being a good treaty partner and other partner and with other agreements to provide financial support, technical support, and capacity building support so that First Nations have control over their own infrastructure.
Are you going to reform some parts of the Indian Act, such as those that I mentioned, very specifically? For example, also I spoke to insurance, and I spoke to the title of the Act. Can you confirm that during this legislature we'll see huge changes to the Act?
Well, I think you can rest assured that we will be working in all of the ways that we can to support the self-determination of people, First Nations people, at the speed and in the ways that they want. It's why the legislation on First Nations clean drinking water is so important, in fact, because that's part of that work, to support First Nations with adequacy of funding that's co-developed and that provides a framework to better have control over the water that serves their systems.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant.
Thank you very much.
Minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll thank the Minister for being present with us today. I'll take a different approach than I think often is taken in these kind of committee meetings to try to paint a picture, I think, of what has been largely the story or more modern narrative of our country. Are you familiar with the traditional stories of many nations, including the area I come from, of shapeshifters?
I am, actually, yes.
And shapeshifters, you may know, their nature is the same, but how they appear is different. The things they do is different. How they operate is different. But the nature of that being is the same, sometimes for malice and sometimes for benevolence. But the issue with the shapeshifting is it seeks to deceive. It seeks to use the better will of those who would see others and the goodwill that they could offer as a benefit to manipulate. Canada and our country has largely been a shapeshifter in its approach to Indigenous people. As a colonial state in the 1867, its establishment, it sought to bind Canada together with two bands of steel and largely with the force of the Northwest Mounted Police, bringing many Indigenous nations to their knees in using this objective force to force the creation of reserve systems, to forcefully reserve Indigenous people. It then would shapeshift into a settler colonial state that we notice in our parents' and grandparents' generation, this attempt to take away the rights of Indigenous people in the pursuit of a more noble idea that they thought they were doing something right, this idea of equalization. What if we just enfranchise everyone? They will be equalized. And we've seen that the paramount of that work manifested in the former Prime Minister Trudeau's white paper. It was, of course, rejected by Indigenous people from Alberta in particular. Harold Cardinal brought forward the red paper, which rejected this approach, this assimilation approach to what the government's intent was, even though at one side they told Canadians what they were doing was good. Just like Sir John A. Macdonald said to Canadians when he built residential schools, this is for the goodness of Indigenous people. I find it very difficult to believe that the state today has changed in its objectives towards Indigenous people. It's evidenced by these audits, and there will be no answers that you can give us today to build credibility towards that fact. But I hope to, at least today in my time, in our discussion today, to at least have you realize and reflect the very deeply disturbing nature of the mandate of your ministry and Crown Indigenous Relations and the overall principle from the Prime Minister's office of how they're undertaking reconciliation. The ideology that's being undertaken sounds great, just like Sir John A. mentioned, the residential schools would be great. Just like we've seen Pierre Elliott Trudeau say the destruction and elimination of Indigenous rights was going to be great. We see today the attempt of this government to use the very legitimate claims of Indigenous self-determination, the very real exclamation of their rights to their own lands, to their own people, to their own future, as an excuse in the delay that is being experienced when it comes to material enhancements in community. You said it in your speech that the number one process that will solve this problem takes partnership, and true partnership takes time. Unfortunately, there are people who suffer in the time that is undertaken. And could you comment on who suffers the most when time is often given to the benefit of the government? Who suffers the most?
Well, I think we know who suffers the most, and I think it's represented in the kinds of historic compensation that we've seen under our government. The $20 billion in child welfare legislation, or child welfare compensation, the $8 billion in lack of access to clean water. But the difference is this government is no longer hiding from not only the legacy of the colonialism of this country, but trying to form those better relationships. And please be assured that I believe, and as I was responding to MP Shanahan, that the time, you're right, people suffer, children suffer, families suffer, but But I think the time is changing. And I think MP Shanahan's example is a good one of the kinds of efforts that can be put forward at all levels of government, including ours, which has to show that leadership and that equity.
No, I appreciate that response. And it highlights my next point, which is second to the new kind of colonialism that the state is undertaking today. This reconciliation first model that on the front of it, especially if you go to the West Coast, and I'm sure you have, their tradition of the transformation mask, where you see a beautiful mask, and it means, it's welcoming in some ways. But then when the mask opens and the raven's mouth is bare, you see what it truly is. And it's a shockingly disturbing sight. It's a sight that would use, for example, compensation tools that were largely met because First Nations had to force the government to court in order to get that compensation is truly disturbing. And the fact that many of the agreements, nearly all of the modern agreements your government has signed are largely liability agreements. They seek to devolve the liability of the federal government to housing, to water, to jurisdiction of families, to Indigenous people. And you mentioned the care and control. That's the part where the care and control piece is very difficult, because in the court of law, where the government loses 99% of its court cases on liability issues, we see the government respond to those liability issues by presenting agreements that on the face of it look really good. But deep down within them, if you read those agreements, it's a transfer of liability, care, and control. So when you see care and control, you also mean liability, correct?
Question, Mr. Desjardins. Your time is up,
So,
so if you have a
I
question.
guess
That was the question.
Okay,
Mr.
thank you.
Desjardins,
Minister, you have the floor.
Do I have the...
Yes, you do. You have the floor for an answer.
Thank you,
Yes, pardon
Mr.
me.
Chair. There's a lot packed into your statement. And, look, at overall, I can understand why First Nations people are on a continuum of trust with this federal government or any government or really any space in this country. I mean, let's talk about, just briefly, racism in healthcare. Many First Nations people don't trust healthcare systems that were intended to be for all, but in fact, Indigenous people have been excluded from for decades and since their institution. But I will just say that we have over 150 10-year agreements that were carefully created by those First Nations and signed on behalf of the government and those First Nations. And we regularly support those First Nations in the delivery of services. And I would ask that if you have particular First Nations that are not happy with their 10-year agreements, that they would reach out to my office.
It'll be a yes or no.
Sure.
Thank you. The question is largely in regards to the government's attempt to devolve or seek care and control devolution, it's often been known as. Does that include the liability for those services?
I'm going to turn to Nelson just to speak about some of the mechanics of the 10-year agreements.
Thank you for the
Just
question.
the liability, please. Who is liable now that these agreements are signed for the failure to deliver service?
So there, as we've mentioned in this committee before, on the pathway to transfer, there's been a transfer agreement signed, and that's the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, which we spoke to. The organization, the Atlantic First Nation Water Authority, administers water services for its member communities, including the regulatory services and the administration.
Sorry, you're not
of
answering the
water.
question. Who's now liable?
Mr. Desjardins, I will have to come back to you. You will
I feel
have
it's a yes or no question, Chair.
We're
Why are they avoiding
well
it?
over the time, and you will certainly have an opportunity to come back again. Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Haidu, I proudly represent the riding of Brantford-Brant. I also represent the First Nations community of Six Nations of the Grand River. And I'm sure the Minister remembers I have written to you on numerous occasions regarding the federal funding needed for the Gayaweni Immersion School on Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Despite my previous correspondence and numerous follow-ups over the past 3 years, my office has not received any updates regarding the status of this necessary funding. The initial request for funding was literally 8.5 years ago. This delay has led to a significant increase in project costs, creating challenges for the school's operations. Last month at this very committee, I raised the issue, and a member of your ministry indicated that they would follow up. So can you tell us today when we can expect to receive the urgently needed funding?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I do have a letter here dated March 30th that I sent to you, Mr. Brock, March 30th, 2023. So I assume that you have that in your possession as well. So in terms of not responding, I do want to put it on the record that, in fact, I did. But I will say that Indigenous Services Canada has supported the design brief for the school, and we're continuing to engage with the school across government departments.
When was the last time you engaged?
I believe I was in Six Nations last year, but we can check the exact date.
I'd like to get the exact date.
I will get you the exact date.
Okay.
I visited
you
not
indicated
only Six
you
Nations
corresponded
with,
to me
the
in
former
March.
Chief, but Chief
I have the
Hill.
floor. You indicated to me you responded, and I know you dislike that, but this is members' time, not ministers' time.
Mr. Brock, the witness is minister's aware of the rules. This is your time. We've gone over this before.
I don't think she does, Chair, but thank you.
Mr. Brock, you've got 3 minutes.
Thank you. So you responded over almost a year and a half ago. In that particular letter, I'm sure you spelt out no specific timeline as to when this school is going to get the necessary funding. How long do the children of my community, the children of the Six Nations community, have to suffer with inadequate funding? Why can't you write a check and find the necessary funding, as we've been pressing your ministry for the better part of the entire tenure of your government? What do you say to the people of the Six Nations?
Well, first I say thank you for the visit and for the opportunity to work on the many issues that Six Nations continues to drive forward, including, I think, their incredible economic development success. And I will say that we'll continue to work with them on the successful
Which is a non-answer. Thank you so much. The AG's report underscores the long-standing health hazard posed by mold in First Nation communities. And she concludes that ISC appears to struggle in fully understanding the severity of the issue. I want to illustrate a case again from my riding. The Gagno's Medical Center of the Six Nations of the Grand is the sole medical center with federal employees providing vital dental and sexual health services. Was compelled to close due to mold infestation. They reached out to you personally. You refused to meet with them. This scenario should highlight the urgency of the situation. When will your ministry earnestly address these matters, prioritize funding for this crucial medical center, and provide a meaningful response to the Six Nations community?
Well, thank you for your question, and I assume by the line of your questioning that when Indigenous items come up for voting in allocations of funds and in budgeting, that you will vote in favor, and I'll watch for your vote. Because, in fact, as you know, we have a very significant infrastructure gap, and any appropriation of money from the federal treasury that goes towards Indigenous spending is critically important to actually complete these kinds of projects.
When will you When will you fund the mold removal so that the 25,000 residents of Six Nations do not have adequate medical services? That is an absolute disgrace, and it's on your shoulders, Minister. When are you going to clean up the mold?
Well, I really look forward to the letter that you'll write in support of my next budget ask that will ensure that Indigenous Services Canada has a significant investment in closing infrastructure gaps so that we more quickly can build the infrastructure across the country that I hear you agreeing we need to do quickly.
Thank you. That is the time, I'm afraid. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister Hajdu, for coming to another committee to speak again on this important issue of housing in the First Nations communities. I'd like to go back to talking about housing and the infrastructure gap. Why do you think it took so long to figure out the true costs of the housing and infrastructure gap?
Well, thank you very much, MP Yip, and thank you for your advocacy in this area. And I would say that I don't think previous governments wanted to know the size of the infrastructure gap, in particular the previous Conservative government. who, as you know, didn't invest in any significant way in the needs of Indigenous communities, First Nations communities in particular, but certainly in Inuit communities and Métis communities. And so this is the important work that has to be done, and it's an uncomfortable truth. I think that's why governments don't want to quantify things like this, because when we know that the infrastructure gap, currently estimated at $360 billion, is that size, it means that governments must act, and they must act creatively, and they must encourage partners to think about ways that we close that gap together differently. It puts and centers the needs of Indigenous communities in our conversations, at least for some of us, and certainly I think that's part of the reason the gap has never been quantified before.
Has the government's approach changed to closing the gap since we were able to put a dollar figure on it?
Well, I think you saw ambition in this year's budget, in Budget 2024, where fully almost 25%, 24% of new spending is on Indigenous priorities. And it's a commitment, an ongoing commitment of the federal government under the Liberals to keep reconciliation centered in the work we do. It isn't an easy journey. It isn't a short journey. But as I say often in speeches I give and in places with partners and in First Nations, that the flame of reconciliation is lit. It's like every other tiny flame. It needs constant nourishing and protection from anything that might put it out.
Just the other day, we heard some excellent testimony from Chief Lance Heyman about his work to build homes on reserve finance through private capital. I found that very interesting. And are you looking at options like Chief Hammond's to help close the housing gap?
Right person, I'm sorry. Yes, we are. The short answer is yes, we are. We are looking for anything that can leverage the investments of the federal government in the work of closing the infrastructure gap, including innovation and financing that is Indigenous-led, including in supporting deeper connections between the private sector, who often has capital to invest, but many barriers to investing that capital in First Nations endeavors. I would also note that Chief Heyman was here when we tabled the water legislation, Bill C-61, and he was an active participant in the co-creation of that legislation, as well as many other First Nations across the country. And I think that he is a significant leader to watch in terms of the kinds of creativity that we need across this country to deal with such a gap.
Yes, he did mention looking at both Indigenous-led and others. In the financial sector. Are you talking to anyone in the financial sector?
Absolutely, I certainly am. In fact, as I mentioned, we had the second economic roundtable just a couple of weeks ago. The first we hosted, the Indigenous Services Canada team, and did a fantastic job. We had representation from all of the major banks and all across the financial sector. There was such enthusiasm that the Bank of Canada offered to host the second one. That gave me a lot of excitement because, of course, they were able to ensure that there were a variety of different partners at the table, including all of the major banks, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the First Nations Bank of Canada, and many others. And so there is an enthusiasm, I will tell you, in corporate Canada to really challenge ourselves on the kinds of barriers to accessing capital that First Nations communities and First Nations businesses are facing. And I look forward to the next steps in this work.
Why do you think some of these initiatives have taken so long to gain momentum? I'm really glad to hear that some of these major banks are stepping up or at least interested, but it seems like it's been a long time. Why?
Well, I would say that some banks and some institutions actually have come a long way, and they have a variety of different professionals and departments within their bank that's very focused on economic reconciliation and capital access to First Nations and supporting Indigenous businesses. Others do not have that same expertise. And I would say that, look, the history of Canada has been economic exclusion of First Nations people. This is a hard pattern to break. But the good news is, as I sense that from capital markets, from corporate Canada, that there is a growing recognition of the economic advantage of reconciliation. This isn't just the right thing to do. This is the smart thing to do.
Thank you, Minister. Encore une fois, Madame Sicle de Gagné pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a specific question for you, Madam Minister. What do you have to say about the recommendation that we heard earlier this week, saying that the Parliament should adopt a bill that between now and 10 years we should abolish the Indian Act? What's your opinion on this?
I would say that I would like to hear from First Nations in a larger way, because not everybody has the same perspective on how to do that, and how to do that in a way that protects the rights that are enshrined within the Indian Act, as repulsive as that act is to many people. What I have also heard from some First Nations leaders is that it also has protections that need to be enshrined in other ways.
Parfait.
Great. And so do you have a timeline? Do you have a timeline as to when you could do a total and complete review of the Indian Act? Do you have an end date? Could we share this with the committee on the reforms that you might want to implement?
What First Nations leaders tell me is that the way that we are going about this, by creating specific legislation like the child welfare legislation that restores inherent rights of Indigenous people to care for their own children and families, is the right way to do this. It allows for a controlled dismantling of the Indian Act that puts control back in First Nations in a timeline that makes sense to them. It provides certainty around funding models, and it provides the supports that First Nations say they need in order to do a thorough consultation and design of those systems for their communities.
Avez-vous remarqué que ce soit à travers...
Have you noticed that through the Auditor General's report or through the testimony provided by Mr. Amond, that oftentimes the most wonderful initiatives between First Nations and new Canadians, if we can call them that, the French or the English, regardless, that the best examples are oftentimes in Quebec, and whether it be the Pays des Braves or others, the Quebec people have. Don't you think that we could have a nation-to-nation approach such as that we've had in Quebec?
I think that is exactly the approach we're taking, is a nation-to-nation relationship with First Nations people. I would also say that there is fantastic work happening on creating tools that First Nations people are saying they need to fully capitalize from the economy of Canada. I'll point to the $5 billion loan guarantee that was announced in Budget 2024, roundly applauded by First Nations leaders, First Nations business, who say now they will have the economic tool, the capital tool that they need to be able to fully participate in major infrastructure and major energy projects across this country.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant is Mr. Desjardins. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We spoke to one of the country's most modern Indian agents probably ever in our history, Michael Wernick, just the other day. And his testimony was extreme in his approach, not just to his time at Privy Council and his advice to Cabinet and his advice to the Prime Minister's office on this tremendous need to move past the Indian Act. And he even recommended that it should be abolished within 10 years. And then he even criticized that now, the sitting government, as not having the will to do what he has recommended. He's the same gentleman that largely has been the deputy minister for the years that these audits have been present to them. From 2003 to today, under his watch, he then recommended this insidious approach that has largely made up the mandate of the reconciliation process that's undertaken by the government today. This issue he presented, that the courts were being utilized by Indigenous people who are seeking justice, rightfully by Indigenous people, but the government was losing billions of dollars and finding itself in a position where its liability was being challenged, and there needed to be a risk management approach to this liability. A very disgusting way to speak about human rights breaches in our country, to measure things down to who is liable and how does the government risk assess its liability out of this. These are real conversations that I know are present in your ministry and also ministries between you and the Ministry of Justice. You often get briefing notes from the Ministry of Justice and memorandums that seek to limit the risk that is present between government agreements that you sign on behalf of the Crown with Indigenous people. So I'll ask again, who is liable when care and control is transferred to an Indigenous government?
I think I'll answer broadly, but I would say that no agreement is signed without full participation of the partner organization or First Nation. But I'll turn to Mr. Barbosa.
Thanks for the follow-up question.
Limited time, so if you can please just answer the question.
The first point is who is the agreement with? So the transfer of care and control is not a de-evolution or a transfer of responsibility from the Government of Canada to a First Nation. What's happening in Atlantic Canada across the country is the establishment of organizations like the Assembly of First Nations who work with First Nations to support the administration
If a government, an Indigenous government, is to litigate like they have in the past under these new agreements, who is liable?
So the litigation prerogative still remains with First Nations. The relationship with Canada shifts to the organization that First Nations decide to stand up. And those organizations, like in the Atlantic context, manage
Another
water.
means the responsibility and liability shifts
The water
to the organization from the Government of Canada.
No, it's about the relationship. The relationship changes from the First Nation to the organization that the First Nation determines they want to run their systems.
And that is the time, I'm afraid. That is the time. Turning now to Mr. Nader. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, thank you to our witnesses for joining us. In a previous line of questioning, Mr. Brock brought up a very local example from his area about mold, and we've heard this through the Auditor General report. And one thing that the Auditor General noted very strongly is that there was no indication of when or why or for what reasons the 2008 mold strategy ceased to operate. We asked this question to your Deputy Minister. We have asked this question to the former Clerk of the Privy Council, to the former Deputy Minister at the Department, but we have yet to receive a clear answer. So you've now had several weeks since this report has tabled. Can you tell us why the mold strategy is no longer being used?
Answer that. I don't know the answer. So just, if I may, Mr. Chair, a number of years ago, there was a specific mold strategy. At a certain point of time, we decided with the participation of First Nations to make that particular funding stream as flexible as possible, including if they wanted to invest in mold, if they wanted to invest in housing, if they wanted to invest in lot remediation or what have you. It was in the purview, and it is in the purview of First Nations to decide.
So really not a really answer to when that actually stopped being used. When was it stopped?
Over a number of years, so there's no precise time where.
And I think the point that the deputy is making is that in true spirit of self-determination, prescriptive programs that define for First Nations what exactly this particular line of money must be used for, First Nations have often said is not helpful because, as you know, mold remediation has a number of different steps along the way, including the protection of homes from the ongoing onslaught of water, which, by the way, is an increasing challenge related as it relates to climate change.
In the Auditor General's report, and I'm going to quote here, she wrote, "Overall, we found that among communities of similar sizes, communities with the poorest housing conditions received less targeted funding than those with better housing." So when we talk about the situation that we find ourselves here today, why is it those in the most need are actually the ones receiving the least amount of funding?
I'll turn to Mr. Barbosa to answer that question.
No, Minister. I would like you to answer this question. This is your department. You are accountable as the minister. Why is it those in the most need are receiving the least amount of funding?
So you get to ask the question, and I get to answer it. And I'm going to turn to Mr. Barbosa for the answer.
Thank you for the question. Very briefly, I would say we recognize the housing gap is large. I would say we assessed the same level of data that the Auditor General did, and we looked at communities with the poorest housing conditions and how we allocate money. And we found that from 2018 to 2023, First Nations with the highest need received approximately 39% more funding per capita than communities with other housing and higher housing conditions. We also looked at the metrics that were proposed by the Auditor General, looking at communities with housing with 100 or fewer housing units. And we found roughly on average that those communities received roughly 50% more funding than communities on the other end of the spectrum. So we don't disagree that the housing need is great. What we take a little bit of concern with was how the metric was portrayed in the report.
And I'm sure First Nations communities appreciate you quibbling with metrics when there are folks in this country who are not having adequate housing. I'm sure they appreciate you quibbling with metrics. But I want to follow up. Chief Lance Heyman said this: the bigger challenge that most of these initiatives are proposal driven. So those with the greatest needs have the least capacity. So lesser capacity First Nations are getting less of the national budget. Would you agree with what Chief Heyman said here earlier this week?
I would say in part for certain infrastructures, proposal-based infrastructure funding can be very challenging for communities. But I would also say that there are communities where multi-year funding is in place, and that does provide the flexibility that Chief Heyman has noted is important. I will also, MP Nader, encourage you to vote for any measures that increase spending for Indigenous priorities, and I will note that you voted against them all.
I would also note, Minister, that you have failed to address the actual concerns of folks on the ground in these communities. Do I have enough time for a quick question? In response to Mr. Melillo's question, you said that all requirements, funding requirements, were to comply with the building code. But what the Auditor General found was that the department did not have documentation certifying that the projects actually met the building codes. How is it this lack of documentation exists within your department?
Well, the department works very closely with First Nations, as you know, in a true nation-to-nation relationship. And we work with First Nations to ensure that the approach does not follow the colonial history that I would say the former Conservatives were very fond of, and perhaps, judging by the line of questions today, would be fond of again, whereby communities are penalized harshly for any perceived infraction of any code. And so we work with First Nations to support the maintenance of buildings, to ensure that new builds are compliant with code, and we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. That's the time. Ms. Bradford, you have the final 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. Indigenous communities are at the forefront of our fight against climate change. Obviously, it's hard to make long-term plans when your community is forced to evacuate or rebuild every year because of a wildfire or flooding. How big of an impact is climate change having on construction timelines and costs? And what are you hearing from the First Nation partners?
Oh, wow. That's actually an emotional question for me, because I've visited with so many communities that have been devastated by either floods or wildfires. In fact, just a few months ago, I was in Squalix and Lytton First Nation on the West Coast, who experienced a devastating wildfire in 2021, I believe it was. And now here we are in 2024, and the new houses are just arriving. In fact, after a devastating event like that, there is site remediation. There are oftentimes evacuations in a crisis mode, and then long-term evacuations. Those First Nations have worked incredibly hard to support members to come back to their communities, often in temporary housing. One community, Lytton First Nation, had temporary mobile units for families, so they didn't have to stay so far away from their community for so long as the housing was getting rebuilt. In fact, oftentimes, and I think this is I found this very striking. You know, one of the buildings that burnt down was an administration building where, in fact, many members had said that there were remains of First Nations people from time immemorial. Of course, the then colonial government did not listen or believe that story of the members. And in fact, in the remediation process through archaeological examination, in fact, there were a significant number of remains of former members. That takes time to do the archaeological underpinning for any of that kind of work. In Squalex, it was truly incredible to see just how fast things are moving, with some internal capacity to do all of the civil engineering that is required to work with people like BC Hydro and the many other service providers to hook up electricity. I could go on. MP Bradford, the last thing I'll say is that climate change is presenting an ongoing and escalating risk to First Nations communities who are often on the front line of these crises. During wildfire season, my department has a specially trained team of people who can very quickly pivot to emergency management supports. First Nations themselves have emergency management coordinators. We've funded increased capacity, but increasingly we're seeing the devastation of climate change wreak havoc on Indigenous communities.
So along that line, is there any thought of permanently relocating some of these communities to safer areas not so prone to natural disasters such as flooding or fire, so they don't have to go through this constant turmoil year after year?
Well, I mean, to answer that question, first I have to say that First Nations people were put there
I know.
intentionally out of way from colonial cities and towns, dispossessed from the land that they had inhabited for a very long time. And so the process of moving community is very emotional. If a community is interested, for example, in the potential of exploring that, of course, the Government of Canada, under our leadership, would be supportive of that. And there are communities that have a routine and ongoing flooding. The challenge is where, to be honest, and the challenge is also connection to that land, connection to that. I just told you the story of remains in a community where these are remains that could be centuries old. So it's not as easy. I would ask you the same, I suppose, if Bradford, I'm sorry, I forgot your community.
Well, actually, the one I'm living in now is Kitchener.
Okay, so if Kitchener all of a sudden was uninhabitable, it would be a very emotional thing to contemplate.
I understand.
Leaving.
I just wonder.
And so what I would say is it's really important that we do everything in partnership with First Nations. So
exactly.
When a First Nation is interested in contemplating something like a relocation, of course, the Government of Canada, I believe, has an obligation to entertain the support of that. But I can tell you those are deeply, deeply emotional conversations and thoughts.
Right. So returning to the
brief question.
About the importance of self-determination and a nation-led approach. Could apply to this too. Where do you see the balance between transferring control to First Nations and ensuring that the government is doing its job by proactively supporting the communities, equipping them with the tools they need for success, and making sure that they're not left on their own or set up to fail? I mean, we look at this with water management and all these different things. Well,
I think I'm glad that you spoke about water, because I will say I just got a letter today from the Blackfoot Confederacy talking about their support for the Bill C-61 legislation that we've just tabled and that will be arriving at INAN committee. And I'd just like to read you in a statement. They say, no consultation process will ever be perfect. However, starting over 2 years ago, all First Nations were offered a significant opportunity by Canada to be directly involved in the development of Bill C-61. Our nations provided extensive legal and historical submissions about our treaty water rights at the outset of the consultation process. We met many times with Canada's Bill C-61 team to review and comment on drafts of the legislation, and by the time Bill C-61 was introduced in Parliament, we were able to get significant changes made, including broadening the recognition of our inherent right of self-government to include all aspects of water in general, not just drinking water. We also secured the protection in S-15 of the rights of First Nations to sufficient supplies of water, which is critically important in many regions where water scarcity is an issue. Our general point is that all First Nations had the same opportunity to consult with Canada about Bill C-61 over a period of more than 2 years. These consultations were meaningful in our experience and resulted in real and significant improvements to Bill C-61. So to me, that is the approach that I think we need to continue to take. It's truly partnership. It's challenging our systems and institutions to share power, to listen to First Nations about what they want to see in the governance of not just their community, but this country. They are valuable partners.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is the time, and we're well over. Ms. Wilson, would you be able to provide to the committee in writing, I'd like some more details around the why the mold strategy is not being used anymore. I'm struggling to understand what you said with kind of the Treasury Board requirements in terms of spending envelopes and then delivery. I don't want to ask for an answer now, but if you could get back to the committee, please, with an explanation on that how that program was phased out with a little more specifics and timeline, the committee would appreciate it.
Happy to send the committee a brief.
Thank you. Mr. Desjardins, I'm going to need unanimous consent for you to ask a question. We are. Oh yeah. Okay.
It's actually in addition to your request for documents.
Yes.
If we can also include in the request for that update in writing a request for an update in the department's response to the Auditor General's point made in 2.34 related to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, that the Auditor General found that the ministry, in cooperation with CMHC, underfunded the Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba region by using outdated and old formulas.
Would that be possible, Ms. Wilson?
I can't promise for CMHC.
In terms of the department's response.
If the question is about what data we use in terms of appropriating funds, we use current census data.
Yes.
You use current census data in this regard?
Yes.
Okay, sure. That would be good if you can supply that. But I understand that this portion of the agreement speaks directly to CMHC in cooperation with ISC.
I don't believe so. I believe
There's
it's
no
about how
each
department appropriates their funds, and for ISC we appropriate against current census data 2021.
And so this is not. You're saying this is not your problem.
I'm saying there's two parties to ask that question to.
And you have no responsibility for it.
I have a responsibility for ISC funding, which we use 2021.
All right. No,
so in this regard, none.
All right. Could you do your best if there's an aspect that you're responsible for? If you
just do something about it, my God.
We'd be happy to provide a funding history of how we appropriate funds.
Can you talk to CMHC at least?
All right, Mr. Desjardins, we'll get a response, and then we'll take next steps. I would thank the minister, but she's already left. That's very, very unusual. Order, Mr. Desjardins. I would thank the minister.
Kinds of answers, Chair.
Let's get the answer back, and then this committee can take steps if you're not satisfied with it. But
I'm not satisfied. They're not doing it.
We're well over.
It's someone's problem.
Mr. Desjardins, I'm granting you extra time. I allowed a back and forth.
And I appreciate that, Chair. Not against you.
We're going to get an answer. We will see what they respond, and then this committee can take it up again. Again, you have my commitment on that we will look at it and act if necessary.
Thank you, Chair.
Very good. Again, the minister's left already, very, very unusual. So I'll thank the officials. I'm sorry the minister is so busy. She had to rush out before we conclude our business. I will suspend this meeting, and we'll call on the next minister within a minute. The minister and other witnesses could take their seats, please. I'm going to welcome everyone back. And to switch gears, conformément à l'article 108.3G.
In accordance with Standing Order 108.3G, the committee resumes consideration of Report 1, ArriveCan, referred to the committee on Monday, February 12, 2024.
Witness, the Honourable Bill Blair, PC, MP, Minister of National Defence. Thank you for coming in today. We appreciate it. And your officials from the Department of National Defence. We have Stephanie Beck, Deputy Minister. Ms. Beck, is this your first committee appearance as a Deputy Minister?
Not as Deputy Minister, but as Deputy Minister of National Defence. It's day 4.
Very good. Well, welcome. This will be a good run through, because I'm sure you'll be at National Defence soon enough. So very good, and congratulations on the appointment. Troy Crosby, Assistant Deputy Minister, Materials Group, and Isabelle Desmarty, Assistant Deputy Minister, Human Resources Civilian. Mr. Blair, you have 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the kind invitation to come and appear before this committee. As you've already noted, I am joined by our new Deputy Minister of National Defence, who was previously a Deputy Minister at Agriculture, but Ms. Stephanie Beck and the others, and I won't repeat them because you've done so. First of all, if I may, I'd like to be clear with members of this committee that while I have the benefit of excellent and regular briefings from these senior officials with me today, I have had no direct involvement in the matters that this committee is studying. Hiring decisions and the administration of the public service is rightly the responsibility of the Deputy Minister. Ministerial intervention in this area is both inappropriate and wrong. However, each of us takes the issue of transparency and ethical conduct in government contracting very seriously, as does every single person at the Department of National Defence. We know that every dollar counts, especially when it comes to protecting Canada and Canadians, and that Canadians expect all of us to use their hard-earned money wisely. I'd like to spend the next few minutes highlighting the rules, expectations, and processes that are in place to ensure that we're meeting the highest standards possible when we contract outside the department. The defence team is made up of a dedicated group of people who are responsible for protecting Canada and Canadians, as well as advancing Canadian interests around the world. To support their critical work, our department will sometimes seek third-party expertise from outside contracting firms. And in these types of contracts, and indeed in all procurements, the department must follow Canadian laws and policies to the letter. Procurements must be conducted in a fair, open, and transparent manner in accordance with Treasury Board policies, as well as regulations, guidelines, trade agreements, and procedures. We recognize the importance of the competitive contracting process. 95% of all contracts awarded by the department over the past 3 years were awarded competitively. However, in some limited cases, including for some lower value contracts, the department will occasionally procure goods and services through a non-competitive process in order to deliver results quickly. In all cases, we ensure contracts are awarded transparently and achieve expected results, delivering value for money. We also have defense ethics training available to all employees at the Department of National Defense, and as with all departments, we are obligated to publicly disclose all contracts over $10,000 on the Open Government portal. Likewise, we expect all defense team members and all third-party organizations to follow the highest ethical standards as they carry out their duties. All employees are made aware of their responsibilities surrounding conflicts of interest.